right, so we're going to be making fern collars today. All of the materials that we've got to start out with for now, we're gonna have toothpicks, we've got a reach lighter, a scale and cup for mixing and weighing out our resin. You can easily use measured cups if you would like instead. A pipette for applying resin, popsicle stick for mixing, and of course our mold. You can easily make your own mold if you want, but for brevity's sake today we're going to be using one that I have purchased. Alright, so starting out we're just gonna go ahead and mix about an ounce of resin. You generally speaking don't want to mix any smaller amounts than that. Otherwise it'll affect the clarity of your end result. Alright, so now that I've got my gloves on, make sure you're using protection. I'm going to use my amazing clear cast plus. And we're going to weigh out equal parts of A and B. Alright, so I'm going to set a timer for about 5 minutes and make sure that I'm mixing thoroughly, but slowly. Alright, so now that we are done mixing, I'm going to let my resin sit for another about 5 minutes, just so that way naturally some of the air bubbles will start to release and it'll be ready to work with. So now that our resin is ready to work with, I'm going to make sure that our mold is free of any hairs or anything. I think we're looking pretty good here. Essentially what we're going to do is put a very thin layer of resin down so that all of our ferns are fully encapsulated in the resin. Get a little resin in there. And remember, we don't want to fill these up all the way, we're just putting a layer down. One of the great things about pipettes, or if you want to use a syringe, that's totally fine too. But one of the best things about using that type of application method is that you can also take resin away if you've added too much. So right now I'm just taking away some of that excess resin, making sure I have enough room to work with my ferns. Now that we have our mold with a thin layer of resin in the bottom of each piece, and now we can use any toothpicks or a lighter to get out any bubbles that may be there. And we can use a reach lighter to get rid of any bubbles. We're gonna go ahead and let that harden for at least 3 hours before we go and do another layer. It's totally fine to come back to it the next day if you want to make it a multi-day project as well. Alright, so we have our layer of resin that has hardened. Now we are ready to start filling our molds with ferns. So for this step, really all we need is our mold. We've got scissors and tweezers, which will help us cut down the ferns to better fit the mold, and then tweezers to help us get them in there. And then I've also got my flower press with some ferns in there that are pressed and dried. So make sure that any botanicals you're using are entirely dried, because any amount of moisture will ruin the chemical reaction that hardens the resin. So, open up the flower press. And essentially I'm gonna be picking pieces that already kind of match the natural shape of the mold. But of course I can trim things down as well. Seems like that'll be a pretty good fit. And right now I'm just gonna get a rough idea of where I want things. We can go back and actually trim things better once we have decided approximately which pieces we're using where. Alright, so I have pretty much figured out which ones I want to use. I'm going to close up my press again. And now we can start trimming up the ferns to better fit the mold. And now we're pretty much ready to mix up more resin and put on a top layer to seal up these pieces. And now we're going to go ahead and mix up our resin for the rest of our piece. I'm going to end up mixing much more because I'm also going to work on other things. Just a reminder that if you're going to mix a smaller amount, only do about, or make sure that you're doing at least an ounce. No less than. So the resin is mixed and set and ready to work with. For this step, I've got, again, a pipette, we've got resin, we've got our molds that are all set, and toothpicks as well for popping any bubbles that we need to pop or getting the ferns back into place. Really just start filling those molds until everything is covered, but make sure that you're not overfilling. Great, so now we are all set to make sure that all the ferns are where we want them to be. We're gonna pop any bubbles that we can with a toothpick, and anything else we will get with a torch. And your ferns might have a tendency to want to float up to the surface. That's totally fine. That's just because they're less dense than the resin, so we'll just want to keep coming back to the pieces until they start to set a little bit, to make sure that our ferns are where we want them. But otherwise, we are pretty good to let our pieces sit until they harden, and then we'll be ready to put them onto chains. All right, we are now ready to demold our collar necklace pieces and put them onto chain settings. So there might be some little bits of resin still on the outside that you'll need to clean off with either scissors or pliers, and we'll do that in just a moment. So I'm just going to go back through with some pliers and pull off those little bits of resin that have stayed on. And if you overfilled your mold even just slightly, which tends to happen, there will be a little bit of resin in the holes of your mold, which totally fine. You can use a dowel to just get that out of there. And now we're practically done. We just need to set them onto chains now that everything is demolded and cleaned up. So to do this, I'm going to set them on 2 separate chains about 8 inches long, and then I'll attach them with jump rings. All right, we're now on to our next step, which is just assembling everything. So I've got my 6 pieces of chain cut out, 2 for each collar piece. I've got some small jump rings. I've got some medium jump rings, and then our clasps. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with a big jump ring here. Now that we've got our jump ring attachments to all of these, we can go ahead and start attaching them to their chains. I'm going to take a small jump ring, attach it to the end of this chain, and then through the medium jump ring. On one end you can attach your lobster claw clasp, and on one end just a blank jump ring to complete the necklace.